So my name is Michael Maloof. I'm the head of marketing here at Earnest Analytics. We're the leader in consumer and healthcare data for companies and investors. I have the pleasure to introduce longtime Earnest data user Daniel McCarthy and his research associate Shin Oblander as we discuss those short and long-term impacts of COVID across multiple categories of spending. So in the way of introductions, Dan McCarthy is an assistant professor of marketing at Emory University's Gazetta School of Business. He specializes in the application of leading-edge statistical methodology to contemporary empirical marketing problems. His research interests include customer lifetime value, limited data problems, and marketing finance interface. He popularized the customer-based corporate valuation, or CBCV, methodology that drives any traditional valuation model off that underlying behavior of target companies' customers. His work has been featured in major media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Economist, and CNBC. And his research has been accepted and published in top-tier academic journals, winning numerous research awards. So his most relevant today, he actually powers many of these statistical methodologies with Earnest data. In addition to his roles and responsibilities at Emory, Dan co-founded and was chief statistician at Zodiac, which is a predictive customer analytics SaaS firm. Nike acquired Zodiac in March of 2018, and since Dan has founded Theta Equity Partners to revolutionize how private equity, venture capital, and even independent companies quantify value through their customer-based corporate valuation, a serial entrepreneur in our midst. Shin Oblander, he's a PhD candidate in marketing at Columbia Business School, who develops econometric methods for modeling consumer decision-making. Shin's research has been published in the Journal of Marketing Science and featured in news outlets such as the Wall Street Journal as well. So Daniel, Shin, welcome to Earnest. We're so glad to have you on today. And I will let you get started with some of your findings.
All right, great. Thanks so much for having us. This is, we're just, we couldn't be happier with all of the collaboration that we've had with Earnest over the past handful of years now. And I think if it wasn't for your data, we would not have been able to bring this project together. So, I think I just kind of wanted to first reiterate the power of it, that we're able to get such a granular view of what customers are doing across so many different categories over a relatively long period of time. So obviously, there's a lot of different use cases that one could apply this data to. The one that we're going to focus on today is the impact of COVID. So it's kind of on everyone's mind. People are wondering, what has it done to baseline, and where are we relative to baseline? COVID, it had a dramatic effect on how on consumer behavior, especially early on. But there's very big questions about where we are now relative to what we would have expected to be had there been no COVID. And so a lot of this work, it's about kind of figuring that out and saying, these are the categories that were dramatically affected in the upwards direction, the downwards direction, how that's been evolving over time. So so maybe what I thought I would do is I would just share my screen now. This will stop on that. Okay, so hopefully now, let me pull this screen up. I don't know if everyone can see my screen. All right. So yes, this is joint work with Shin. Shin is really the brains of the operation here. He's the one that's been leading this project. So you'll be hearing all the really smart comments from him and all the dumb ones from me. I've got a link to the paper over here to the extent that you're interested in doing a deeper dive into it. I figured I would just make it more accessible. So I'm going to kind of tuck it in the bottom right corner of the screen. If you just pulled up your phone, I think to the extent I can figure out how, I'll also just share a link to it in the chat box if I can. So yes, again, the substantive motivation for the paper is pretty clear. I mean, this is kind of $1 trillion question. A lot of behaviors have changed. It's changed how we eat. It's changed how we work out. It's changed how we travel. It's changed how we consume content. It's changed how we buy furniture. It's changed how we buy clothes. It's changed everything. And a big question is, are those changes permanent or not? Or to what extent have some of the COVID-induced changes persisted over time? Yeah, that's really what we want to know. And it's really a big question. And there's kind of two extremes to the interpretation that we've seen about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of articles that have been written about how COVID has permanently changed behavior. At least some of the changes that we saw, that they've kind of continued to hold on very persistently. Yes, in this article, again, when you see words like forever, that's really what I'm referring to. On the other hand, we've seen a growing number of other articles citing data like this one. So this is a chart that's showing the market share of e-commerce as a percent of total retail sales from 2000 up until relatively recently. And basically what the data would show is we saw a very steady, gradual increase in market share growth for e-commerce. And then during COVID, we saw a very sharp increase. And since then, we've fallen right back down to where we would have expected to be had there been no COVID. So again, the point here is not that we haven't grown relative to where we were. The question is, have we grown relative to where we would have expected to be in the absence of COVID, which is really what that red dotted line is supposed to represent. And so again, I think, hopefully we can all agree the effects of COVID have been very different over time. And so there's this question of how much is persistent, as we move towards the new normal. Is the new normal the old normal? Or is it somewhere in between? And so that's really what our methodology is going to help us disentangle. And the second piece is, obviously, the effects could be different across different categories. So how it affected how we buy meal kits might be different from how we buy furniture. And we want to be able to see, we want to see those differences. And then potentially it can help us draw conclusions as to the nature of the effects it has as we move across categories. Again, a lot of companies, I think their valuations are riding, at least to some extent, on the answer to this question. So we want to know, are we way below where we would expect to be, kind of when we normalize? Will these changes hold on? I think the answer to questions like that, to a large extent, will help dictate what revenue is going to be in the future. And I think for that reason, a lot of the work has gotten cited a number of times. So we had a previous version of the paper that specifically just focused on restaurant delivery. This was just a sampling of the articles that it was featured in. We've since expanded our analysis to all 12 of the categories that I showed on that previous slide. So we'll be going through some of those conclusions closer to the end of the presentation. And now this work is starting to get featured as well. So, it's been in the Wall Street Journal and NPR and in a couple other places too. So, hopefully it's kind of indicative of this being an important question and also of, kind of interest in this work in particular. But this is not just a paper about COVID. Obviously, COVID is the empirical example. It's a very interesting and important one. But I think the methodology, it's important kind of for two reasons. One, it's a methodology that can be used in other settings. And for two, it's not all that trivial to be able to kind of do that disentangling, to be able to figure out what the baseline would have been in the absence of COVID. And so, so I think there's a real methods contribution to what we're doing here that could be of interest to some of you. Obviously, you're probably interested in COVID's effect, but even if you were also interested in just the effect of some other discrete action that happened at some point in time, I think that this could be very relevant for you as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Shin to kind of go through in more detail, kind of both the methods contribution here and how we carry it out.
All right, thank you, Dan. Let me switch to sharing my screen. So picking up where Dan just left off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodological aspects of our paper. So we have a more general question that we're answering, and in our empirical study, we're answering it in the context of COVID, but more generally, what we're interested in understanding is, if we have some kind of shock or event that happens that changes the behavior of a population of interest, And this event is sort of ubiquitous. It affects everybody in our population. So we don't have a control group in the traditional sense of the word. How can we measure how big the effect of the event is and how persistent that effect is over time? It's not straightforward when we don't have a baseline group for comparison. So beyond COVID, you could imagine if you're studying a specific firm, a company spanning events such as a policy change or a event that spans a category or economy such as a regulatory change. These are things that affect all of your customers. And so you don't really have a control group to compare against. A recent example of this could be, for instance, Elon Musk acquiring Twitter. What has that done to user activity on Twitter? This is a big event that has affected everybody on the platform, and so you don't have a control group for comparison. And what we're going to propose today is a method to estimate the overall impact of a discrete event such as this over time that doesn't depend on sort of the specific mechanisms. So, COVID has a lot of different ways it's affected our behavior. There's supply side factors, there's demand side factors. We're not going to necessarily separate those things out. What we're going to do is try to measure the overall impact of all of the different things that have happened in the post-COVID period compared to a counterfactual baseline where there hadn't been the pandemic. So just to recap, the contributions of what we're doing today, Dan very well motivated the questions about how has consumer behavior changed during COVID, what do things look like in the new normal, and methodologically, how can we try to infer the effect of an event where you don't have a control group in the usual sense? We're going to have a bunch of validations and extensions of our methodology, although we won't get too in the weeds with that today. So as you might expect, the data for our analysis comes from Earnest Analytics. It is very cool data to work with. We've been working with row-level transaction data where we have a panel of about 2 million panel members who are working with after some filtering. And just to give a sense for kind of the scale of the analysis, just looking in the 12 target categories that we're working on, we observe about $35 billion in spending over the course of our data set. This covers over 1,000 different companies, pretty much any major brand you could think of. From 2016 up through June of this year. Or sorry, June of last year, it's 2023. And one nice thing about the Earnest data is we might worry about people switching between purchasing on different credit cards or debit cards. And through this data set, we're able to link different cards used by the same individual, which helps us to more consistently track the same individual over the whole period of this data set. So to start off, I wanted to just show some simple descriptive graphs. So the figure on this slide shows for the 12 categories that Dan had discussed in the first slide, their weekly sales as observed in the Earnest panel from the start of 2017 through June of last year. And the patterns are pretty obvious, especially in the short term. Right? We can see for a lot of these sort of online or e-commerce type categories, take restaurant delivery, you see as much as a doubling of sales almost overnight in April of 2020. Conversely, for a lot of these more offline or brick and mortar categories like retail or entertainment, you see movie theaters drop to almost zero revenue overnight. But it becomes a little bit less clear what the long-term effect is. If we look at a category like in-store furniture, up to seasonality, the sales patterns are pretty consistent over time. And so we can see there was this big drop and then it bounced back and then it's been pretty stable ever since. But let's zoom in on another example category, such as restaurant delivery. In the baseline, there's a pretty interesting growth pattern that doesn't look necessarily like a straight line or an exponential curve or anything. It's a little bit unpredictable. And intuitively, what we'd like to do is what people in empirical finance call an event study, where we try to fit some kind of trend to the pre-COVID data and take take a linear trend, project it out into the post-COVID period, and the gap between what we predict and what we observe, we would attribute to being the effect of COVID. Intuitively, this is a nice idea. It would probably work pretty well for a category like in-store furniture sales. But of course, in a case like this, where we still have a growing category that's not fully matured or stabilized yet, the forecasts, especially going out, past a few months into COVID, are going to really depend on the specific functional forms that we assume. So, for instance, if we assume something more like a quadratic trend, we're going to infer something much different about what the long-term effects of COVID are. So, a method like this isn't going to work sort of as is. If we're just naively extrapolating off of sales, this will give us pretty good answers in the short term. You can just kind of visually see the effect of COVID for the first couple months, but over a longer horizon, we'll be less confident in our inferences. So now I'm going to take you through a few steps to how we develop our methodology. I won't go into a ton of detail, but this will give a high-level overview of what we end up doing. So this example graph here shows for a given cohort. This is the cohort of everybody who first purchased a restaurant delivery order in the week of March 3rd, 2019. And for that cohort, this is showing their repeat sales per cohort member over time. So soon after, the week after their initial purchase, you're observing they spend about $7 per person on average on food delivery. And this is the curve over time. The vertical line represents March of 2020. After that, you start to see this cohort being affected by COVID. The question is, what's the counterfactual baseline? Imagine if we just did a flat curve, if we just took the end of this curve and extrapolated it, if we took a linear trend. There's a number of different functional forms we could assume that would each give us different answers. So the idea is to get a comparison, a valid comparison for this treated group, we're going to compare to older cohorts on the same cohort time, so time since their first purchase. So here, this is the same graph, but I've just relabeled the x-axis that now instead of calendar time, it's tenure. So this is the number of weeks since the members of that cohort placed their first order. And now we've added on to this plot the same time series for the cohort from March of 2017. So the key thing to notice here is this left panel for the 2017 cohort represents the year of 2017, and then here is 2018. And so over both periods, over both years of this graph, this cohort is unaffected by COVID, right? And so the idea is we're going to compare the 2019 cohort to the 2017 cohort at the same period of tenure to try to make a control group comparison of what this cohort would have done had they not been affected by COVID. So you can see, for the 2017 cohort that is not affected by COVID, there's this tenure effect over time. But there's also a level shift where the 2019 cohort tends to spend more money than the 2017 cohort. And if we're willing to assume, what we'll call a parallel trends assumption in econometrics, then we assume that in the absence of COVID, these different cohorts would have been just level shifts of each other, that they would have had parallel trends. Then we could extrapolate and say, well, this is what we think the 2019 cohort would have done in the absence of COVID. And it's this gap that we will call the COVID effect. This is a pretty simple approach, but it's not going to work directly. It's more a motivation for the method we end up using. And the reason is the parallel trends assumption isn't always satisfied perfectly. So if a simple cohort comparison worked, then it should be that, well, it shouldn't matter whether I look at the March 2017 cohort or the March 2018 cohort or the April 2017 cohort. They should all look roughly parallel to each other. And so in this graph, we're adding in the March 2018 cohort. And what we observe is, well, they look roughly parallel, but the trends are a little bit different between the 2017 and the 2018 cohort. And depending on which of these cohorts we use for comparison, we're going to get slightly different answers about the overall impact of COVID. So this leads us to the approach that we're going to use, which is going to be controlling for other calendar time effects. So what we find across a number of different categories is that this violation of parallel trends, where you see slightly different tenure effects by cohort, seem to be attributable to calendar time effects. So this includes obvious things like seasonality or holidays, but it can also include other macroeconomic changes like pricing changes or inflation. It can include the overall sort of growth or geographic expansion when you're considering services like restaurant delivery that have been expanding their geographic footprint over time. And so we're going to account for cohort effects, tenure effects, and calendar time effects via what's called an age period cohort or APC model. And the idea is this allows us to flexibly compare different cohorts while also controlling for calendar time effects. So I'll flash a couple of equations here. Let's denote our outcome of interest, y subscript c of t. And so, for instance, in many of our analysis, this will be the sales per cohort member for a given week. C denotes which cohort it is. T denotes what week it is. The APC model is going to be a three-way decomposition where up to an error term, we decompose the effects of the cohort, the tenure effect of how long since acquisition, and the calendar time effect. And this calendar time effect is what's going to be primarily of interest to us. It's going to capture the effect of COVID, but it's also going to capture the effects of seasonality and all kinds of other things going on. So this type of age period cohort model, we're not the first people to use it. It's the invention of the demography field. It's used a lot in sociology. And it's been used a little bit in marketing. Primarily where we see it used is in the demographic sense, where cohort represents an actual birth cohort. So this is the first time we've seen this kind of methodological lens applied to modeling customer relationships. I'm going to hand wave a little bit on the methodology. If you want the full details, the link to the paper is in the bottom right. I guess it's slightly obscured right now. But to give you a sense, this panel shows our estimates of the calendar time effect after we've removed seasonality. So what you see is there's a clear effect of COVID, right? There's this huge jump due to COVID. But even in the pre-COVID period, there's some oscillation in this pattern. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do ultimately an event study, like what I had motivated on an earlier slide, where we say, let's fit a time series model to this curve, and then try to forecast how it would have evolved in absence of COVID. But because we've now removed all the cohort and tenure effects, this is a much more stable and predictable process compared to working off of just raw sales. So to briefly go over validation of the model, the APC model tends to fit the data very well. For example, in the restaurant delivery category, we find that the model explains about 99% of the variation in sales. And in general, we find that this assumption that basically any parallel trends violation is due to calendar effects seems to be borne out well in practice. When you allow for other violations of additivity, they don't really seem to add much to the model. So going back to our earlier cohort comparison, this was the curve that I had showed you of these three cohorts. This is what it looks like once you subtract out the baseline calendar time effects. And so now these three cohorts look pretty darn parallel, except for that post-COVID period, where the 2019 cohort is affected by COVID, and so their trend diverges from the other groups. So going a little bit into the results, this is what we estimate for the restaurant delivery category. So on the bottom right, we have sales week by week post-COVID, and this tells us the percentage lift in sales. So what we estimate to be the incremental effect of COVID on sales relative to what we would have expected in a baseline scenario where there had been no COVID. And what we observe is that overnight, there's about a doubling of sales. You see about 130% increase in sales just in early May of 2020. This effect deteriorates over time, but not in a straight line. We see, for instance, during the winter waves of COVID, you see a big resurgence of people using delivery services. But what's interesting is that as of about February of last year, this effect is within a margin of error of 0. And so the effect that we infer is, the long-term effect that we infer is actually quite small and not statistically significant. What's interesting is we can decompose this effect of sales into a few different component behaviors, right? We can have the number of active customers, how frequently those active customers are placing orders, and how big of orders they're placing. And so when we decompose the total effect on sales, what we find is, well, a lot of this growth was being driven by growth in the number of active customers, but that growth has entirely gone away. In fact, it's even a little bit below baseline. Whereas the effects of how often people make orders and how large of orders they make have been more persistent over time, but with smaller boosts. We see in the long term about a 14% boost in how frequently people are placing orders and an 11% boost in how large of orders they're placing. So I'm going to pass it back to Dan in a second to talk about how this effect extends to other categories. And just for brevity, so we don't have 48 different graphs to show you, Dan's going to focus just on the sales effect. But overall, we observe a pretty similar decomposition where across categories, most of the effect is coming from just differences in active customers with kind of smaller effects of purchase frequency and purchase size. All right.
All right, great. Yep, so now I'm going to basically move back into sharing my screen. So hold on one sec, let me get this up over here. And thanks so much for those who've been posting the questions in the Q&A. I've been trying to man the Q&A boxes as best I can, but yeah, please keep the questions coming. And certainly, yeah, hopefully we'll have some time at the end as well, but obviously, if you have any questions in the meantime, we'd love to discuss. So yes, those were the results specifically for restaurant delivery. Again, they're kind of our running example, but we wanted to give a glimpse into the results as we kind of move across those 12 categories that we showed before. So we're going to start with the short-term results. I don't want to kind of deluge you. In some sense, as you can see from that previous slide, we have results and how, in terms of how COVID affected customer activity, order frequency, basket size, and how it rolls up into spend. And summarizing all of that over this relatively long post-COVID period for 12 categories, it would be a lot to take in. So the simplifications that we're going to make, we're going to just focus on the sales effect, which in some sense is the most important of those four. But again, if you go to that link to the underlying paper, we have all the results for all the categories shown in the web appendix. And what I'm going to first do is I'm going to show the results for basically the immediate onset of COVID. Right after COVID, what was the effect? And then we're going to move to the longer term effects. So again, I showed those 12 different categories right at the beginning of the talk, and we're just going to kind of run through each of those one by one. So again, this is just kind of a repetition of what we just saw. Restaurant delivery right after COVID hit, sales were about 130% higher than they otherwise would have been. How about some of the other categories? So I'm just going to kind of work my way row by row. It's a sit-down restaurant, air travel, movie theaters, grocery delivery, meal kits, furniture, e-commerce, in-store furniture, at-home fitness, physical in-store gyms, apparel, e-commerce, and in-store apparel. So again, very big shifts in both directions, depending on the category. So this is a question that how can we make sense of it all? So the first clear distinction is between the offline and the online categories. So if we took a look at all the categories where the purchase event was happening in a store, or that you consume the product or service, in close proximity to other people, like in gym, they were all hammered. So they were all down somewhere between 83 and 99%. The ones that moved up were the online categories. And there's a little more variation here. In some sense, you can see there's kind of the categories that were up like 100% plus. And then there were the other categories that were up between 25 and 50%. And the second kind of key distinction that kind of separates the one group from the other is the business model of the firm. That as we can see, it's just the non-subscription firms that experience the 100% plus lifts. The subscription firms went up a lot less than that, at least right after COVID started. So again, meal kits and at-home fitness, this is like the Pelotons of the world. Those were the ones that saw, reasonable lift, but it just wasn't 100% plus. And I think part of the reason for that is it's kind of intuitive that you're going to panic buy toilet paper. You're not going to panic subscribe to Blue Apron, or I guess maybe some people were getting the Pelotons, but again, you just wouldn't expect as severe a reaction right after the immediate onset of COVID as you would for some of these other categories. So again, it was all the non-subscription categories that saw, gains of 94 to 130%. So again, that kind of makes intuitive sense as well. But was something that it's a dynamic that I'm not sure I had heard people really call out when people have talked about the impact of COVID. So let's move to the longer term. In some sense, the short term is obvious. The longer term, I think, is where the results get a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to take each of those charts that we just showed before, but I'm just going to remove that white box that is covering the longer term effect. So again, for restaurant delivery, we could see that when we kind of roll forward the clock to June of 2022, the lift is no longer statistically significantly different from zero. You see that uncertainty band about our point estimate, and it's kind of covering the 0 point. So how about the other categories? This is sit-down restaurant, air travel, movie theater, grocery delivery, meal kits, furniture, e-commerce, in-store furniture, at-home fitness, gym, apparel, e-commerce, and in-store apparel. And right away, the first thing that kind of just hits you is that in a surprisingly large number of these categories, the lift went away. It just all went away, where it's not statistically significantly different from zero. So the longer term lift, the new normal is basically the old normal in most of the categories. I kind of highlighted with these boxes over here, the ones where, for all intents and purposes, the short-term effect completely went away. So, we can see in something like 8 of the 12 categories, the effects were basically indistinguishable from zero. Now, the subscription categories were kind of an interesting exception to that, at least in part. And so when we focus especially on meal kits and the gym category, we can see that in both cases, the longer term effect is still surprisingly significant. So meal kits, they were up 27% after the immediate onset of COVID. And they're still up, they're up even more, actually, as of June of 2022. They're up about 45%. So those gains have really stuck. And similarly, we kind of saw in the gym category, when the gym shut down, no one was going to the gym. And so, revenue kind of went down like crazy. Very quickly, though, it kind of bumped back up again. But it's been stubbornly negative at about negative 30%. And again, I think that's because people have been finding alternatives to the gym the fact that it's a subscription seems to be playing a role in terms of the persistency of the negative lift in their case. I'm going to talk about at-home fitness a little bit later. In some sense, they're kind of a hybrid category. And so if you think about a company like Peloton, before COVID, Peloton was getting something on the order of 75% of its revenue from the hardware sale, from the sale of the bike. So they do have a subscription, but in some sense, you could think of companies like Peloton as being non-subscription businesses that require a subscription. And as a result of that, I think the decline in hardware sales, which is non-subscription that we've been seeing, I think has been pulling down the lift as we've moved forward to June of 2022, even though I think if we were to have focused specifically just on the stream of subscription payments, that we would see results that are much more like what we see for meal kits. So again, there's more persistency on average in the subscription categories. And I think this is in part because, you're getting that thing or you're doing that activity, you're getting billed every single week or month. And I think it leads to it could be suggestive of habituation, that people are forming stronger habits around that activity than they would for some of these other more discretionary categories where they need to actively continue to think about it before they make a purchase. So these are all the non-subscription categories. And again, we can see that in most of them, the gains have gone away in virtually all of them, except for a couple exceptions. So it's really over here that we saw a lot more transience to the impact of COVID. Now, there were a few notable exceptions. So again, we talked about at-home fitness. In some sense, they're a subscription business with a lift that's gone down to zero. But again, I think that can be explained away as being due to the fact that they're kind of more a non-subscription business than a subscription business. But the other interesting thing is, you can see in those furniture categories, there's been kind of surprising weakness, especially in online furniture sales. As of June of 2022, what this is suggesting is that spending in the online furniture category is about 50% lower than we would have expected had there been no COVID. And in some sense, I think this is also being driven by the fact that the product that's being sold is a durable good and not a non-durable good. So, if you bought that couch, if you set up that work from home desk in your basement, you probably don't need to buy a desk again. And so I think a lot of the things that people were buying right at the immediate onset of COVID was pulling forward of demand that led to people not needing that stuff later on. And so again, when we go back to the Peloton example, I think this is the other thing. In addition to the bike being fundamentally a non-subscription purchase, there's the fact that if you bought a bike and you put it in your basement, you probably don't need to buy a bike again for at least the next few years. And so in general, there's kind of what we call intertemporal substitution that might be going on that will be leading to even more weakness for the non-subscription sales in categories like these. And you just won't get that with something like restaurant delivery or grocery delivery because, food, you need to have food every day. You can't, buy so much food that you eat and say, I don't need to eat for the next couple of months. Food is something that you need every single day. So you just won't, you could expect that you'd have a little bit of a different dynamic for durable goods versus non-durable goods. So in summary, just to kind of wrap up, I think this method, it could be very useful in a variety of different settings. We've obviously applied it to COVID, which is really top of mind these days. But as Shin was describing early on in the presentation, there's just a variety of other settings where this could be very applicable as well. There's just so many times where things happen and they affect everybody. And you want to know the effect, the causal effect that those things had on your customers. And I think this is one of the more natural methods that you could use to actually be able to quantify those effects. In terms of the COVID specific effects, again, we could see a very clear online offline difference in the short run effects, with the offline categories being down 80% plus, and the online categories, I'm going to put that in quotes, being up either 100% plus in the case of the non-subscription firms, or between 25 and 50% in the case of the subscription ones. In terms of the long-run effects, the new normal seems to be by and large the old normal. We've seen a lot of transience to the effects, and in some sense, it's kind of good for all of those in-store categories that had gotten hammered. It's somewhat kind of negative for the online businesses that potentially had been investing significantly in being able to satisfy kind of peak COVID level demand that may not manifest itself for quite a long time in the future. These results are also quite positive for subscription businesses, all else being equal. That at least there you kind of have this slow to enter, slow to leave dynamic. So on the one hand, less likely to get totally hosed by supply chain disruptions because you have to satisfy very different levels of demand. But the fact that the gains have held up much more meaningfully over time, it's just a good thing for those businesses. I think the non-subscription businesses, again, they're in a little bit more of a pickle. So hopefully you found this interesting.